The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the town square that hot September afternoon in 1866. Dust hung in the air as people crowded around the wooden platform in the center of town. Some came to buy, others just to watch the spectacle. The war had ended over a year ago, but its shadow still stretched long across the South. Jonas McKenna stood at the back of the crowd, his weathered hat pulled low over his eyes. He was a tall man, lean from hard work, with a face that rarely smiled anymore. Most folks in town knew him as the quiet rancher who lived 50 miles out, the one who kept to himself and only came to town when absolutely necessary. Today he'd come for one reason only, to bid on some cattle he'd heard were being sold. But what he saw when he arrived made his blood run cold. The auctioneer, a portly man with sweat staining his shirt, was trying to sell people. Not cattle, not horses, people. Even though the war had ended, even though slavery was supposed to be over, here they were, still treating human beings like property. The auctioneer called it contract labor and indenture, fancy words that meant the same ugly thing. Then Jonas saw something that made him stop breathing for a moment. A woman was being pulled onto the platform, and in her arms she clutched a tiny baby. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 months old, with chubby cheeks and wide, frightened eyes that seemed to sense its mother's terror. The woman held the child close, whispering desperately to the auctioneer. Jonas couldn't hear her words from where he stood, but he could read the panic in every line of her body. She was begging, pleading. The auctioneer shook his head and roughly pulled the baby from her arms. The woman's scream cut through the noise of the crowd like a knife. It was a sound of pure anguish, the kind that comes from the deepest part of a mother's soul. She reached for her child, but 2 men held her back as the auctioneer raised the crying infant above his head like a piece of merchandise. Fine, healthy baby here, folks. Strong lungs, as you can hear. Who'll start the bidding? The crowd laughed. Some made jokes. Jonas felt sick to his stomach. He'd come here to buy cattle, maybe some tools if the price was right. He had money in his pocket, enough to make a decent bid on whatever he needed. His ranch was doing well enough, despite him working it mostly alone since his wife died. He could afford to buy that baby if he wanted to. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Jonas. Everyone in town knew the McKenna ranch. They knew Jonas had money even if he didn't flaunt it. The auctioneer's face lit up with greedy hope. Mr. McKenna, surely a man of your means could use some help around that big ranch of yours. Start us off with a bid, won't you? All eyes turned to Jonas. The crowd waited. The mother's sobs had quieted to a desperate whimper as she watched, hoping, praying that whoever bought her baby might show mercy and buy her too. The infant wailed, its small face red and scrunched with fear and confusion. Jonas stood frozen for a long moment. 3 years ago, he'd held his own son in his arms, a baby boy with his wife's eyes. That child had lived only 2 weeks before fever took him. His wife had followed 3 days later, and Jonas had buried them both under the oak tree on the hill behind his house. He'd sworn that day he'd never let himself care about anything that much again. The pain had been too much to bear. Now, standing in that dusty town square, hearing that baby cry, seeing that mother's desperation, all that pain came flooding back. His chest felt tight. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The auctioneer called out again, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. Come now, Mr. McKenna. A simple bid to get us started. Jonas looked at the baby. He looked at the mother. He looked at the crowd of people who saw nothing wrong with this scene, who treated it like entertainment, like shopping for livestock at the county fair. Then Jonas did something that shocked everyone in that town square. He turned around and walked away. Not a word. Not a bid, not even a glance back. He just turned his broad shoulders to that platform and started walking, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The crowd gasped. People started whispering, muttering, some laughing nervously. The auctioneer's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. Coward, someone yelled from the crowd. Too good to participate in honest business, McKenna? High and mighty rancher thinks he's better than us. Another voice called out. Jonas kept walking, past the general store, past the saloon, past the church that stood silent and complicit on the corner. He untied his horse from the hitching post and climbed into the saddle. His hands were shaking, something they rarely did. Behind him, he could still hear the auction continuing, the auctioneer working himself into a frenzy, trying to recover from the embarrassment. As Jonas rode out of town, heading back toward the empty ranch that waited for him 50 miles away, He could still hear that baby crying. The sound seemed to follow him, mixing with memories of his own son's cries, his wife's final labored breaths. He'd walked away from that auction, yes, but he didn't feel like a coward. He felt like a man who'd just drawn a line in the dirt. A line he refused to cross no matter what anyone thought of him. In a world that had gone mad, sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to participate in the madness. The ride home would be long, and Jonas knew he'd have a lot to think about along the way. The horse's hooves fell into a steady rhythm as Jonas headed west, away from town and toward the ranch he'd built with his own 2 hands. 50 miles stretched ahead of him, a journey that usually took him the better part of 2 days with an overnight camp somewhere along the creek. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink. But Jonas barely noticed the beauty around him. His mind kept replaying what he'd seen in that town square. Over and over, like a horrible dream he couldn't wake from. The woman's face, the baby's cries, the casual cruelty of the crowd treating it all like just another day at market. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Bess, seemed to sense his mood. She walked steadily without needing much guidance, following the familiar trail home. Jonas had made this journey hundreds of times over the years, knew every landmark, every turn, every place where the water ran clear enough to drink. The war was supposed to have changed things. That's what everyone said. President Lincoln had freed the slaves and the Union had won. Jonas himself had lost 2 cousins in the fighting, good men who believed they were making the world better. And for what? So that men could still stand on platforms and sell babies like cattle? So that freedom could be twisted into new forms of bondage with fancy legal words? Jonas had never owned slaves himself. Even before the war, when it was legal and common, something in his gut had told him it was wrong. His father had disagreed, called him soft, said he'd never make anything of himself with such foolish notions. But Jonas had built his ranch anyway, with his own sweat and the help of hired hands who got paid honest wages. It had been harder, slower, but he'd done it his way. Then he'd met Helen, and suddenly doing things the right way mattered even more. She'd been the daughter of a schoolteacher, educated and kind with strong opinions about justice and fairness. They'd married in the spring of 1862, right as the war was heating up. She'd made his rough ranch house into a home, planted flowers by the door, sang while she cooked. When she got pregnant, Jonas had never felt happier or more terrified. He'd built a cradle from oak wood, sanded it smooth so there wouldn't be even the smallest splinter to hurt delicate baby skin. Helen had sewn blankets and tiny clothes, her face glowing with joy as she felt the baby kick inside her. The baby, a boy they named Thomas, had come early. Too early. He'd been small, so small that Jonas could hold him in one hand. For 2 weeks they'd fought to keep him alive, taking turns staying awake to watch over him, trying everything they knew to help him breathe easier, to get him to take milk. Helen had barely slept, barely eaten, pouring all her strength into that tiny life. When Thomas died on a cold February morning, something broke inside Helen. She held their son's still body and didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at nothing. 3 days later, she developed a fever. The doctor came, but there was nothing he could do. She'd given up, Jonas realized. She'd wanted to follow their baby wherever babies go when they leave this world. Jonas had buried them together, mother and child, under the big oak tree on the hill where Helen used to sit and watch the sunset. He'd carved their names into a wooden cross himself, his tears falling onto the wood as he worked. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Jonas had worked from sunrise to sunset trying to outrun his grief. He spoke to almost no one, went to town only when necessary, lived alone in a house that felt too big and too empty. Some nights he'd wake up thinking he heard a baby crying, only to realize it was just the wind or a coyote in the distance. And today, in that town square, he'd heard a real baby crying, seen a real mother's anguish. It was like God had reached down and grabbed him by the heart, forcing him to feel something again after 3 years of trying not to feel anything at all. The sun was setting now, and Jonas needed to make camp. He found his usual spot by the creek, where a cluster of cottonwood trees provided shelter. He unsaddled Bess, let her drink and graze while he built a small fire. He had some dried meat and hard biscuits in his saddlebag, enough for a simple supper. As he ate, he thought about what would happen when he got back to the ranch. His two hired hands, both older men who'd worked for him since before the war, would want to know about his trip to town. They'd ask if he got the cattle he'd gone to buy. What would he tell them? That he'd walked away? That he'd left empty-handed because he couldn't stomach what he'd seen? They'd understand, Jonas thought. Both of them were decent men. But understanding wouldn't change the fact that he still needed more livestock if the ranch was going to grow. Winter was coming, and he needed to make sure he had enough to see them through. The fire crackled and popped. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted. Jonas lay down on his bedroll and looked up at the stars. So many stars that it seemed impossible to count them all. Helen used to say that each star was someone who'd passed on, watching over the people they'd left behind. He'd never believed in such things, but on nights like this, it was a comforting thought. As he drifted toward sleep, Jonas made a decision. Tomorrow, when he got home, he'd write a letter to a rancher he knew up north. A man who sold cattle and who, Jonas believed, ran an honest operation. It would cost more to have the cattle driven down, but at least he wouldn't have to go back to that town square, wouldn't have to watch human beings sold like property while good people stood by and did nothing. He'd walked away today, and people had called him a coward. But sometimes walking away was the bravest thing you could do. Sometimes refusing to participate in evil was the only form of resistance available to an ordinary man. Jonas closed his eyes and finally, mercifully, fell asleep, without dreaming of crying babies or dying wives. Just the quiet peace of the Texas night and the gentle sound of the creek flowing endlessly toward the distant sea. Jonas woke before dawn, as he always did. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep purple. He rolled up his bedroll, kicked dirt over the remains of his fire, and saddled Bess. If he rode steadily, he'd reach the ranch by late afternoon. The morning air was cool and fresh, and Jonas felt better than he had the day before. There was something cleansing about sleeping under the stars, about being away from towns and people and all their complicated cruelties. Out here, things were simple. The sun rose, the sun set, and a man could almost convince himself the world made sense. As the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, Jonas let his mind wander. He thought about the work waiting for him at the ranch. There was a fence that needed mending on the south pasture, and the barn roof had a leak he'd been meaning to fix before the autumn rains came. Simple, honest work. The kind of work that left a man tired but satisfied at the end of the day. By early afternoon, Jonas could see the familiar landmarks that told him he was getting close to home. The oddly shaped rock that looked like a crouching bear, the stand of mesquite trees where he'd once shot a deer that had fed him for a month, the hill where Helen and baby Thomas rested in the shade of the oak tree. But as he crested the final rise that looked down on his ranch, Jonas pulled Bess to a stop. Something was wrong. No, not wrong exactly, but different. Very different. There were people at his ranch. Lots of people. They were gathered outside his gate, sprawled across the area near the entrance to his property. At first, Jonas thought maybe they were travelers who'd stopped to rest or perhaps people who'd gotten lost on the trail. But as he rode closer, he could see this was something else entirely. There must have been 50 people, maybe more. Men, women, children. Most of them were dark-skinned, and they carried bundles and bags that held what looked like all their worldly possessions. They'd built small campfires, and the smell of cooking reached Jonas even from a distance. Some of the children were playing, their laughter carrying on the wind. Others sat quietly with their families waiting. Waiting for what? Jonas wondered. Waiting for him? His two ranch hands, Old Willie and his brother Frank, stood near the house looking confused and overwhelmed. When they spotted Jonas approaching, relief flooded their faces. "Boss," Willie called out, hurrying toward him. "Thank God you're back. They started arriving yesterday evening, just kept coming through the night and this morning. We didn't know what to do." Jonas dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Who are they? What do they want?" Before Willie could answer, an elderly man separated himself from the group and walked toward Jonas. He was tall and thin, with white hair and a face marked by deep lines that spoke of a hard life. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. "Mr. McKenna," the old man said, his voice strong despite his age. "My name is Isaiah. We've come a long way to find you." Jonas removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "To find me? I don't understand." "I don't know you, sir." Isaiah smiled slightly. "No, you don't know us. But we know about you. Word travels fast among our people, Mr. McKenna. Word about what you did in town 2 days ago. 2 days ago. The auction. Jonas felt his face flush. I didn't do anything. I just walked away. Exactly, Isaiah said. You walked away. When you could have bought that baby, could have profited from our misery, you turned your back and left. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know what that meant to the people who were there? Who saw it happen? Jonas shifted uncomfortably. I just couldn't stomach it. That's all? That's all, Isaiah repeated, shaking his head. Mr. McKenna, most white folks see us as less than human. Property to be bought and sold, or at best, cheap labor to be exploited. The war ended, they freed us, but where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do? The Freedmen's Bureau promised help, but there's not enough to go around. Local landowners either work us to death for pennies or run us off their land entirely. Jonas looked past Isaiah at the gathered crowd. He saw hope in their faces mixed with exhaustion and fear. So you came here? All of you? We heard you were different, a woman's voice said. Jonas turned to see a young woman stepping forward, and his breath caught in his throat. She was holding a baby. The baby from the auction? You? Jonas said softly. The woman nodded. My name is Ruth. This is my son, David. After you left that day, a man from the next county bought us both. He's a preacher, a good man. He freed us immediately, gave us papers and everything. But he couldn't keep us safe. The men in his town, they threatened him for what he'd done. So he told us to come find you. He said any man who'd walk away from that auction was a man who might help. Jonas felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on him. Willie and Frank stood nearby, waiting for him to say something, to make a decision. The ranch that had felt too big and empty just yesterday suddenly felt impossibly small. I don't have work for all of you, Jonas said slowly. I don't have housing. I've just got my small ranch house and a bunkhouse for Willie and Frank here. I can't possibly— We don't need charity, Isaiah interrupted gently. We're willing to work, Mr. McKenna. Hard work, honest work. We've got farmers who know cotton and corn. We've got men who can build, who can work with wood and metal. We've got women who can cook and sew and teach. All we're asking for is a fair chance. Fair wages for fair work and a safe place to be. Jonas took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. This was impossible. Completely impossible. He was one man with a modest ranch. He couldn't take on 50 people. Where would they sleep? What would they eat? How would he pay them all? But then he looked at Ruth and baby David. The child was sleeping peacefully now in his mother's arms, unaware of all the adult complications swirling around him. Jonas thought about his own son, about the life Thomas never got to live. He thought about Helen and what she would say if she were here now. She'd tell him to help. He knew that without a doubt. Helen had believed that when you had the chance to do good, you did it, even if it was hard, especially if it was hard. Give me 3 days, Jonas heard himself saying. Let me think on this, figure out what might be possible. Willie, Frank, can we get some food together for folks? And some extra water from the well? Willie nodded eagerly. Already started on it, boss. Isaiah extended his hand. 3 days is all we ask. Thank you for not turning us away immediately. Jonas shook the old man's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a lifetime of labor. As Isaiah walked back to share the news with the others, Jonas stood there wondering what on earth he'd just gotten himself into. 3 days to figure out how to house, feed, and employ 50 people when he'd been struggling to manage just himself and 2 ranch hands. It was impossible. Completely, utterly impossible. But as Jonas watched the children playing near the gate, heard Ruth singing softly to baby David, saw the hope beginning to bloom on tired faces, he realized something. Maybe impossible was exactly what the world needed more of right now. Maybe impossible was just another word for the right thing to do. For 3 days, Jonas barely slept. He spent every waking hour talking to the people camped outside his ranch, learning their stories, understanding their skills, and wrestling with the biggest decision of his life. The first morning, he sat down with Isaiah under the shade of a large cottonwood tree. The old man had brought a worn notebook where he'd written down everyone's names and what they could do. This here is Samuel, Isaiah said, pointing to a name. He's 42, worked a farm his whole life. Knows everything about growing crops, rotating fields, managing soil. His wife, Betty, she's a cook who can make a feast from almost nothing. They've got 3 children, all good workers. Jonas listened as Isaiah went through the list. There was Daniel, a blacksmith who could repair tools and shoe horses. There was Grace, who'd been a teacher before the war and could read and write better than most white folks. There was Joseph, young and strong, who could build anything if you gave him wood and nails. The list went on and on. These aren't just laborers, Jonas said slowly. These are skilled people. People who should have their own land, their own businesses. Isaiah nodded sadly. Should have, yes. But try buying land when you're black in Texas right now. Try getting a bank loan or a fair contract. The law says we're free, but the people who control everything, they haven't accepted that yet. We need someone who will give us a chance to prove ourselves. Someone who will partner with us, not just exploit us. That word partner stuck in Jonas's mind. That night he sat at his small wooden table with an oil lamp burning, doing calculations on scraps of paper. He looked at his savings, his land, his assets. He thought about what it would take to house 50 people, to pay them fair wages, to feed everyone until crops could be harvested. The numbers were terrifying. If he did this, he'd be risking everything he'd built. One bad season, one serious problem, and he could lose it all. But if he didn't do it, these people would be turned away to face a hostile world alone. Children would go hungry. Families would be split apart. All because he'd been too afraid to take a risk. On the second day, Jonas talked to Ruth. She sat on a fallen log while baby David played in the grass nearby, grabbing at grasshoppers with chubby hands. Why did you come all this way? Jonas asked. You could have gone north to states where things might be easier. Ruth smiled sadly. You ever been torn from everything you know, Mr. McKenna? My mama is buried in Texas. My sister, before they sold her away, she was somewhere in Texas last I knew. This is my home, even if it's treated me cruel. I don't want to run to some strange northern city where I don't know anybody. I want to build something here where I belong. Jonas understood that. This land had been cruel to him too, had taken his wife and son. But it was still home. The land itself wasn't evil. It was just people who made it hard. What would you do if I said yes? Jonas asked. If we tried to make this work? Ruth's eyes lit up. I'd work harder than I've ever worked. I'd help build a place where my son could grow up free, really free. Where he could learn to read and write. Where he could own land someday, where he wouldn't have to bow and scrape to anyone. Isn't that what every parent wants? A better life for their children? Jonas thought about Thomas, about all the dreams he'd had for his son. Dreams that died with him. Maybe, in some small way, helping build a future for these children would honor the future his own child never got to have. On the third day, Jonas called a meeting. Everyone gathered around as he stood on the porch of his ranch house, his heart pounding like it might burst from his chest. I've been thinking, he started, then stopped. Public speaking had never been his strength. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past 3 days. The crowd waited in silence. Jonas could see hope and fear warring on their faces. What you're asking for, it's not small. It would mean changing everything about how I run this ranch. It would mean taking risks that could ruin me. But I've realized something. He paused, gathering his courage. I've been half dead for 3 years now, just going through the motions. Maybe it's time to actually live again, even if it scares me to death. He saw smiles starting to form, but he held up his hand. Wait, let me finish. I can't just employ you all as ranch hands. There's not enough regular work, and I can't pay 50 people fair wages from my current income. But I've got an idea, if you're willing to hear it. Isaiah stepped forward. We're listening. What if we formed a cooperative? Jonas said. I've got 300 acres. What if we used some of that for farming, some for ranching, and built a real community here? You'd work the land, and in return you'd get wages plus a share of the profits. Those who want, they could earn deeds to small parcels of land over time. We'd build houses, a school, maybe eventually a church. We'd be partners in this, not boss and workers. The crowd erupted in excited whispers. Jonas continued, speaking louder. I won't lie to you. It'll be hard. We'll have to build everything from scratch. I'll need to mortgage part of my land to buy materials. We'll face opposition from people in town who won't like what we're doing. It might fail. We might all end up with nothing. Or we might succeed, Isaiah said, his voice ringing with conviction. We might build something that lasts, something that shows the world what free people can do when given a fair chance. Jonas nodded. That's the hope. So here's what I'm proposing. We start with housing. Those of you who know building, you'll work on constructing cabins. I'll pay wages for that work. Those who know farming, you'll help prepare fields for planting. We'll share the food we grow. We'll build this together, and if it works, everyone benefits. If it fails, at least we'll have tried. Ruth stepped forward, still holding baby David. "What do you get out of this, Mr. McKenna? Why risk everything for people you don't even know?" Jonas looked at the baby, then met Ruth's eyes. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and son. I've been so angry at God, at the world, at everything. But seeing you all here, seeing these children, I realized something. Maybe the way to honor the dead is to fight for the living. Maybe the way to heal from loss is to help others build something new. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. "I don't know if this will work. I don't know if we can pull it off. But I'm willing to try if you are." Isaiah walked up onto the porch and extended his hand. "Mr. McKenna, you've got yourself a deal. These people and I will work harder than you've ever seen. We'll build you a community that'll make this whole state take notice." Jonas shook his hand, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Children jumped up and down. Women hugged each other. Men clapped each other on the back. Willie and Frank, who'd been standing off to the side, came forward grinning. "Boss, you've gone completely crazy," Willie said. "But it's the good kind of crazy. Count us in." That night, Jonas sat on his porch long after everyone had settled down to sleep. The camp was quiet except for the gentle sounds of people breathing, the occasional cry of a baby, the soft murmur of parents soothing children. He'd done it. He'd committed to something huge and terrifying and possibly foolish. In the morning, they'd start the real work. They'd begin building a community from nothing but hope and determination. Jonas looked up at the stars, at all those lights shining in the darkness. "Helen," he whispered to the night, "I hope you'd be proud of this. I hope Thomas would have grown up to be the kind of man who'd do something like this." The stars offered no answer, but somehow Jonas felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time since he'd buried his family under that oak tree, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving. He had something worth building, worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't even imagine yet. But tonight, surrounded by 50 people who'd placed their faith in him, Jonas McKenna finally felt like he was truly alive again. The work began at sunrise the next morning. Jonas stood watching as the community organized itself with remarkable efficiency. Isaiah seemed to have a natural gift for leadership, dividing people into groups based on their skills and the most urgent needs. The builders, led by Joseph, started measuring and planning cabin locations. They'd build small one-room structures at first, simple but solid, with room to expand later. The farmers, under Samuel's direction, began surveying the land, identifying the best areas for different crops. The women organized a communal kitchen and started planning how to stretch their limited food supplies. Jonas rode into town that afternoon with Willie, his stomach tight with anxiety. He needed to visit the bank and arrange a loan for building materials. The bank manager, a portly man named Henderson, had always been friendly enough in the past. But when Jonas explained what he wanted the money for, Henderson's expression changed completely. "Let me understand this correctly," Henderson said slowly. "You want to borrow against your ranch to build houses for freed slaves?" "For families who'll be working my land," Jonas corrected. "It's a business investment. We're creating a cooperative farming operation." Henderson leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Mr. McKenna, I'm going to be frank with you. What you're doing out there, it's not sitting well with folks. Word's already spread about the colony of coloreds you're setting up." "They're not a colony," Jonas said, keeping his voice level despite his rising anger. "They're workers and partners, free citizens with the same rights as anyone else." "In theory, perhaps," Henderson said. "But in practice, Mr. McKenna, you're upsetting the natural order of things. Other ranchers are concerned. If you start paying these people fair wages, giving them land shares, what's to stop their own workers from demanding the same? You're creating problems for everyone." Jonas stood up. "Are you refusing my loan application?" Henderson sighed. "I'm advising you as someone who's known you for years to reconsider this foolishness. But no, I'm not refusing. Your credit is good and your ranch is worth the collateral. I'll approve the loan. But don't say I didn't warn you about the consequences." Jonas left the bank with the loan papers but a heavy heart. Henderson's words echoed in his mind. He'd been so focused on the practical challenges of building the community that he hadn't fully considered how other landowners would react. Over the next few weeks, those consequences became painfully clear. It started small. Jonas went to buy lumber at the mill and found the price had mysteriously doubled. When he questioned it, the mill owner shrugged and said something about supply and demand. Jonas paid the inflated price because he had no choice, but he knew what was really happening. Then his fence lines started getting cut. Cattle wandered off, and it took days to round them all up again. Each time the cuts were clean and deliberate, clearly done by someone with wire cutters, not by accident. One morning they found 3 of their best horses dead in the pasture. Poisoned, the veterinarian said, though he wouldn't meet Jonas's eyes when he said it. The community held a somber burial for the animals, and that night Jonas noticed several of the men cleaning old rifles and checking ammunition. "We won't start trouble," Isaiah said when he saw Jonas watching. "But we won't be caught unprepared if trouble comes looking for us." The threats escalated. Someone nailed a crude letter to Jonas's door. The words misspelled, but the message clear: send the blacks away or face consequences. The local sheriff, when Jonas reported it, barely glanced at the letter. "Can't investigate every piece of paper someone leaves around," the sheriff said dismissively. "Besides, McKenna, you brought this on yourself. What did you expect? You can't just upset the whole social order and not face pushback." "The social order," Jonas said bitterly, "was built on treating human beings as property. Excuse me if I'm not too concerned about upsetting it." But despite the external threats, something remarkable was happening inside the community. The first cabins went up, simple structures but built with care and pride. Families moved out of tents and into real homes with roofs that didn't leak and floors that kept the dirt out. Every night you could hear sounds of celebration, children laughing, people singing. Ruth had become the unofficial organizer of the children's education. She didn't have many books, but she used what she had, teaching reading and writing in the shade of a large tree. Jonas watched sometimes, seeing the intense concentration on young faces as they traced letters in the dirt with sticks. "You ever think about what these children might become?" Ruth asked him one afternoon. "That little girl there, she could be a teacher herself one day. That boy might become a doctor or a lawyer. We're not just building cabins, Mr. McKenna. We're building futures." Jonas nodded, moved by the thought, but his practical side kept worrying about the present. The harassment continued, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it got worse. He was right. One evening, as Jonas was checking on the new barn construction, a rider approached. It was Henderson's son, a young man named Robert who'd always seemed more reasonable than most of the town folks. "Mr. McKenna," Robert said, dismounting quickly, "I came to warn you. There's talk at the saloon. Some of the ranchers, they're planning something. I don't know exactly what, but I heard words like, 'Teach him a lesson and burn out the problem.'" Jonas felt ice run through his veins. "When? I don't know. Soon, I think. Maybe tonight, maybe in a few days. My father would skin me alive if he knew I came here. But what they're planning, it's not right. Whatever you think about your situation here, violence is wrong." "Thank you," Jonas said. "I appreciate the warning." After Robert left, Jonas called a meeting with Isaiah and the other community leaders. They gathered in Jonas's house, their faces grim as he shared the warning. "We need to be ready," Isaiah said. "We'll organize night watches, armed if necessary. We won't start violence, but we'll defend our homes and families if we must." "How many of you have experience with firearms?" Jonas asked. Most of the men raised their hands. "We weren't allowed to carry weapons as slaves," one man named Joshua explained. "But during the war, some of us learned. And a man doesn't forget how to protect what's his." They organized shifts, setting up watch posts around the perimeter of the community. Jonas taught the younger men how to shoot, using cans set up along the fence line for target practice. The women made sure everyone knew where to shelter if trouble came, especially the children and elderly. Despite the tension, life went on. Fields were planted. More cabins were built. The communal kitchen became a gathering place where people shared stories and songs. Grace, the teacher, started holding evening classes for adults who wanted to learn to read. The sound of people reciting their letters mixed with the normal sounds of ranch life. Jonas found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. For years, he'd lived alone with his grief, barely speaking to anyone. Now he was surrounded by life and noise and community. Children called out greetings when they saw him. Women brought him portions of their cooking. Men asked his advice on building projects, treating him not as a boss but as a partner. One afternoon, Ruth approached him with baby David in her arms. The child had grown considerably and was starting to babble and reach for things. "He's getting big," Jonas said, smiling despite his worries. "He is," Ruth agreed. "Mr. McKenna, I wanted to thank you. I know things are dangerous right now, but you've given us something we never had before. Hope. A chance at a real life. Whatever happens, I want you to know that matters. Jonas watched the baby grab at his mother's hair, giggling when she gently pulled his hand away. He won't remember any of this, Jonas said. The auction, the fear, the running. He'll grow up thinking freedom is normal. That's exactly the point, Ruth said softly. Every generation should think freedom is normal. That's how we change the world. That night, as Jonas did his watch shift, walking the perimeter of the property with a rifle over his shoulder, he thought about Ruth's words. Change didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments, in individual choices, in communities built one cabin at a time. The stars overhead were bright and cold, indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere out there, men were planning violence against innocent families. But here, in this small corner of Texas, people were building something worth defending. Jonas checked his rifle and continued his patrol, ready for whatever dawn might bring. It happened on a moonless October night, 3 months after the community had formed. The darkness was so complete that Jonas could barely see his hand in front of his face as he walked his section of the watch route. The only light came from the stars overhead and the distant glow of a few oil lamps in the cabins where families slept. Jonas had just reached the eastern corner of the property when he heard it. The sound of horses, many horses moving fast. His heart jumped into his throat as he pulled his rifle from his shoulder and fired 3 shots into the air. The signal. Within seconds, he heard the community responding. Bells rang out. Voices called warnings. Lights began appearing in windows as people woke and moved to their assigned positions. They'd practiced this drill a dozen times over the past weeks. But practicing and facing the real thing were very different. The riders burst into view, maybe 20 of them, their faces hidden behind crude masks and bandanas. They carried torches that blazed bright orange in the darkness, and Jonas could hear their voices shouting obscenities and threats. "Burn them out," someone yelled. "Teach these uppity blacks a lesson." Jonas took cover behind a water trough and aimed carefully. He didn't want to kill anyone, but he'd fire to defend if necessary. Around him, he could hear other defenders taking positions. Isaiah's voice rang out strong and clear, directing people, keeping everyone calm despite the terror. The first attacker threw his torch toward the nearest cabin. It fell short, landing in the dirt and sputtering. But others followed, and one landed on the roof of the communal kitchen. Flames caught on the dry wood, beginning to spread. "Fire brigade," Isaiah shouted. People rushed from their shelters with buckets, forming a chain to the well. Even as the attack continued, they began fighting the flames. Jonas aimed at the ground in front of the next group of riders and fired. The shot kicked up dirt and the horses shied back, throwing off their riders' aim. More shots came from the defenders, not aimed to kill but to warn, to defend. The attackers hadn't expected organized resistance. One of the masked riders got closer than the others, and Jonas recognized the horse. It belonged to the son of the rancher, whose property bordered his to the south. The rider threw a torch that landed near the schoolhouse where Grace held her classes. Before Jonas could react, Ruth appeared from the shadows. She'd grabbed one of the rifles and aimed with steady hands. She fired, and the shot hit the dirt right in front of the approaching rider. The horse reared, and the rider tumbled off, hitting the ground hard. "Stay down!" Ruth shouted at him. "The next shot won't be a warning." The man scrambled backward, leaving his horse and fleeing on foot into the darkness. The fight raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The defenders held their positions, protecting their homes and families. The attackers, frustrated by the resistance and the lack of easy targets, began to pull back, but not before one of them got lucky. A torch landed on the roof of the barn where they stored hay and grain. The dry material caught immediately, and flames roared up into the night sky. "The barn!" someone screamed. Jonas ran toward it, knowing they had to save the structure or lose months of stored food and supplies. But the heat was already intense, driving him back. Then he saw movement inside. One of the horses trapped and screaming in terror. Without thinking, Jonas ran into the burning barn. Smoke choked him, and the heat felt like it would melt his skin, but he could hear the horse's terrified screams. He found the animal, a young mare named Daisy, kicking at her stall door in panic. Jonas fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. The smoke made it impossible to see. Finally, the door swung open, and he grabbed the mare's halter, pulling her toward where he thought the exit should be. A burning beam fell from above, missing them by inches. Jonas could feel his lungs burning from the smoke. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see. For a moment he thought this was how it would end, dying in a burning barn while trying to save a horse. Then hands grabbed him, pulling him forward, strong hands that dragged both him and the horse toward fresh air. They burst out of the barn into the cool night, Jonas gasping and coughing, the mare bolting free into the darkness. Jonas looked up to see who'd saved him. It was Ruth. Her dress was singed and soot covered her face, but her eyes were fierce and alive. "You don't get to die yet," she said, helping him to his feet. "We still need you." The barn collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. But the attack was over. The riders had fled, leaving 2 of their own wounded on the ground. The defenders had held their position. As dawn broke, Jonas surveyed the damage. The barn was a total loss and the communal kitchen had significant fire damage. Several cabins had minor burns from fallen torches, and 2 of the attackers lay groaning on the ground, wounded but alive. One had a bullet graze on his shoulder, the other a broken leg from being thrown from his horse. The sheriff arrived an hour after sunrise, taking his time. He looked at the scene, at the burned buildings and the wounded attackers, with obvious displeasure. "This is what happens when you stir up trouble, McKenna," he said. Jonas, his voice hoarse from smoke, just stared at him. "These men attacked us. They tried to burn us out. And you're saying we stirred up trouble? I'm saying you're the one who brought all these coloreds here, created a situation that was bound to cause conflict." The sheriff gestured at the wounded men. "These are respected members of the community and now they're hurt. They attacked us." Jonas repeated, anger overwhelming his exhaustion. "They came with torches in the middle of the night." Isaiah stepped forward, his face stern. "Sheriff, we have witnesses. We have evidence. These men committed arson and attempted murder. The law says they should face justice." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Well, now that's complicated. These boys got caught up in the moment, that's all. Heat of passion." "Heat of passion?" Ruth's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. She walked forward, carrying baby David. "They came here planning violence. They brought torches and weapons. That's not passion, that's premeditation. Are you saying the law doesn't apply when it's black folks being attacked?" The sheriff's face reddened, but before he could respond, a newcomer rode up on horseback. He was a man Jonas didn't recognize, well-dressed in city clothes with a notebook in his hand. "I'm Franklin Pierce, reporter for the Austin newspaper," he announced. "I've been investigating reports of violence against freed communities. I arrived in town last night and heard about the planned attack. I've been watching from that ridge over there." He pointed to a hill in the distance. "I saw everything that happened. I have detailed notes and I plan to write a full account." The sheriff's face went pale. "Now, Mr. Pierce, you might have misunderstood what you saw." "I saw an organized attack on innocent families," the reporter interrupted. "I saw defenders protecting their homes, and I'm seeing a law officer who seems more interested in protecting the attackers than enforcing justice. It'll make quite a story." Over the next few hours, the situation shifted. The reporter interviewed multiple witnesses, took photographs of the damage, and wrote down names. The wounded attackers, realizing they'd been caught and documented, suddenly became very cooperative, giving up the names of others involved. Word of the attack and the community's successful defense spread quickly. Within a week, the reporter's article appeared in newspapers across Texas and beyond. Letters began arriving at the ranch, some threatening but many supportive. Abolitionists in the North sent donations. A church in Philadelphia collected money to help rebuild the barn. But the most significant impact was local. Other freedmen and women in the region, hearing about a community that had stood up to attackers and survived, began reaching out. Some wanted to join. Others just wanted to know it was possible, that resistance could work. Jonas stood one evening looking at the burned remains of the barn, now being cleared away to make room for a new, larger structure. Ruth approached, David toddling beside her now that he was learning to walk. "You saved my life that night," Jonas said. "I never properly thanked you," Ruth smiled. "You gave me and my son a home. I'd say we're even." "Still," Jonas insisted. "Running into a burning building for someone. That takes courage. So does turning your back on an auction," Ruth replied. "So does risking everything to help strangers." "We all do what we must, Mr. McKenna." Jonas watched little David chase a butterfly across the grass, the child's laughter bright and free. "Think he'll remember any of this when he grows up?" "The danger, the fear? I hope not," Ruth said. "I hope he'll just remember home. A place where he was safe and loved and free. Isn't that what we're building here?" A place where the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we're fighting? Jonas nodded, feeling the truth of her words. The attack had been terrifying and they'd lost the barn and other property. But they'd also proven something important. They'd shown that they wouldn't be easily driven away, that they were willing to stand and fight for what was theirs. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Tomorrow they'd continue rebuilding. Tomorrow they'd face whatever new challenges came their way. But tonight, despite everything, Jonas felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt proud. Proud of the community they were building. The year following the attack brought changes that Jonas could never have imagined. What had started as an act of desperation, 50 people showing up at his gate, had transformed into something much larger and more meaningful. The newspaper article about the attack had done more than just tell their story. It had sparked a conversation across Texas and beyond about how freed people were being treated, about violence and justice, and about whether the end of slavery had really meant freedom. The reporter, Franklin Pierce, had written a series of follow-up articles documenting the community's progress and the ongoing challenges they faced. The publicity brought both support and scrutiny. Donations arrived from churches and abolitionist groups in the North. A Quaker organization sent money specifically for building a school. A group of former Union soldiers, men who'd fought to end slavery, sent tools and supplies along with letters of encouragement. But the attention also brought more trouble. Other ranchers in the area felt threatened by the example Jonas's community was setting. If freed people could earn fair wages, own land, and build prosperous lives, their own exploitative labor practices would be exposed. Some tried economic pressure, refusing to do business with Jonas. Others spread rumors, claiming the community was lawless, dangerous, or worse. Jonas dealt with it all as best he could, but he wasn't doing it alone anymore. That was perhaps the biggest change. For 3 years after Helen's death, he'd been isolated, handling everything himself. Now he was part of something larger. Isaiah had emerged as the true leader of the community, handling disputes, organizing work assignments, and representing them in dealings with the outside world. The old man had a wisdom about people and situations that Jonas respected deeply. More than once, Isaiah's calm counsel had prevented conflicts from escalating. One spring morning, Jonas and Isaiah sat on the porch of what they now called the community house, a larger structure they'd built for meetings and gatherings. They were reviewing a remarkable document, legal papers that would transfer ownership of parcels of land to families who'd been working them. "You're sure about this?" Isaiah asked, though Jonas could see the hope shining in the old man's eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything," Jonas replied. "These families have worked this land, improved it, made it productive. They've earned the right to own it. Besides, this was always the plan, wasn't it? A cooperative, not a plantation." Isaiah studied the papers, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "You know what this means? Black folks owning land in Texas, legal and proper? Some people will see this as a threat to the natural order." "The natural order," Jonas said with a slight smile, "needed threatening." The land transfers were formalized at a ceremony that brought the entire community together. Families received deeds to small parcels, typically 5 to 10 acres, enough to build a home and work productively. The joy on people's faces as they held those pieces of paper, official and stamped and real, was something Jonas would never forget. Samuel, the farmer who'd been among the first to arrive, stood with tears running down his face as he held his deed. "My whole life I worked land that belonged to someone else. Picked cotton that made other men rich. Now I've got earth that's mine, legally mine, that I can pass to my children. You understand what that means?" Jonas understood. He thought about his own father, who'd built the original ranch and passed it to Jonas. That inheritance had given him a foundation to build on. Now these families would have the same opportunity. The community continued to grow and evolve. More cabins were built, these ones larger and better constructed than the first simple structures. The new barn was completed, bigger than the one that had burned, with a loft for storing hay and proper stalls for the horses. Fields that had been wild land were now producing cotton, corn, and vegetables. Grace's school had expanded from lessons under a tree to a proper one-room schoolhouse, built with lumber donated by supporters in Philadelphia. She taught 30 children now, ages ranging from 5 to 15, and held evening classes for adults who wanted to learn to read and write. Jonas sometimes walked past and heard the sound of voices reciting their letters or practicing arithmetic, and it filled him with quiet pride. The church came together slowly, built on Sundays when people weren't working the fields. It was a simple structure, nothing fancy, but it had straight walls, a solid roof, and windows that let in the light. On the first Sunday service held in the completed building, Jonas sat in the back and listened to voices raised in song. The hymns spoke of freedom, deliverance, and hope. People who'd sung those same songs in bondage now sang them as free landowners. Ruth had become central to the community's life in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She organized the communal kitchen, managed the community garden, and had a talent for mediating disputes between neighbors. People trusted her, sought her counsel, brought their problems to her. Jonas found himself spending more time with her than anyone else, not just because of her community role, but because they'd become genuine friends. Both had lost spouses. Both understood grief and the slow, painful process of healing. Both were trying to build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Little David was 2 years old now, an energetic toddler who called Jonas Uncle Joe and seemed to have inherited his mother's fearless spirit. Watching the child grow, seeing him play with other children without any knowledge of the horrors his mother had endured, Jonas felt he was witnessing a small miracle. This was what freedom looked like. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of possibility. One afternoon, Ruth and Jonas stood watching David play with a group of children near the schoolhouse. A traveling photographer had come through the previous week and taken pictures of the community. The images would be included in Franklin Pierce's upcoming book about freed communities in Texas. "You ever think about the future?" Ruth asked. "I mean the far future, 20 or 30 years from now." Jonas considered the question. "I try not to think too far ahead. I've learned that plans can fall apart in an instant. But if you did think ahead," Ruth pressed gently, "what would you hope to see?" Jonas watched the children playing. "I'd hope to see this community thriving. Those children grown up, educated, owning land, raising their own children in freedom. I'd hope to see proof that what we started here wasn't just a beautiful dream that faded, but something real and lasting." "And for yourself?" Ruth asked. "What would you hope for yourself?" It was a question Jonas hadn't allowed himself to ask in years. After Helen died, he'd assumed his life was essentially over. He'd be alone until he died, working the ranch, going through the motions. But now, standing here with Ruth, part of this vibrant community, he realized his life had taken a turn he never expected. "I'd hope not to be alone," he said quietly. "I spent 3 years being alone, and I don't ever want to go back to that." Ruth smiled, a warm expression that lit up her entire face. "Well, Mr. McKenna, I don't think you have to worry about being alone anymore. You've got about 200 people who consider you family." That night, the community gathered for a celebration. The occasion was the completion of the church, but really it was a celebration of everything they'd accomplished together. People brought food, instruments appeared, and soon music filled the air. Jonas stood at the edge of the gathering, watching couples dance, children run and play, and elderly folks sit together sharing stories. Isaiah approached and handed him a cup of cider. "Not bad for a year's work, eh?" Isaiah said. "Not bad at all," Jonas agreed. "Though there's still so much to do. We need better irrigation for the fields, more housing as more families arrive, eventually a proper road to make trade easier." Isaiah laughed, always thinking about the next problem. "Sometimes, Mr. McKenna, you need to just enjoy the moment. Look around you. Look at what we've built. Not just the buildings, but the community. People who trust each other, work together, support each other. That's rarer and more valuable than any barn or church." Jonas knew Isaiah was right. He took a moment to really look, to see not just the work that remained, but the miracle of what already existed. A year ago, these people had been scattered, vulnerable, facing a hostile world with no safe place to call home. Now they had homes, land, a school, a church, and most importantly, each other. 2 young people sent by a freedmen's college in Atlanta to be trained as teachers had arrived that week. The community was investing in their education with the promise that they'd return and teach. It was a long-term investment, thinking not just about today but about the next generation and the one after that. As the evening wore on and stars appeared overhead, Jonas found himself pulled into the dancing despite his protests that he didn't know how. Ruth took his hand and showed him the steps, laughing at his awkwardness but patient with his learning. For the first time in years, Jonas laughed freely. Really laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from deep joy rather than just politeness. The sound felt strange coming from his throat, but good, so good. Later, as the celebration wound down and people headed to their cabins, Jonas walked the perimeter of the community one last time, a habit from the early days of keeping watch. But tonight he wasn't watching for attackers. He was just looking at what they'd built together. 5 years had passed since that morning when Jonas had returned home to find 50 people waiting at his gate. Sometimes, when he looked back, it seemed impossible that so much had changed in such a short time. Other times it felt like that old life, the lonely life before the community, belonged to someone else entirely. Jonas stood at the same spot now, near the entrance to what everyone called the McKenna Cooperative, though Jonas had tried many times to get them to drop his name from it. More than 200 people called this place home now. The original 50 families had been joined by others, people who'd heard about a place in Texas where freed folks could own land, educate their children, and build lives of dignity. The view before him was remarkable. Where there had once been wild grassland and a handful of rough structures, there now stood a thriving community. Neat rows of cabins, each one owned by the family living in it. The schoolhouse expanded twice to accommodate all the children. The church with its simple but proud steeple. A trading post where they sold their crops and goods. A blacksmith shop where Daniel worked, his hammer ringing out a steady rhythm throughout the day. A proper community center where meetings were held and disputes resolved. Beyond the buildings, the fields stretched green and productive. Cotton, corn, vegetables, all growing strong under the Texas sun. They'd built an irrigation system using creek water, one of Jonas's proudest accomplishments. The cattle grazed peacefully in pastures, the herd grown large enough to supply beef to several surrounding towns. Despite some of those towns' initial reluctance to do business with them, Jonas was grayer now, slower, his joints complaining more often about the hard work. But he was healthier in spirit than he'd been in years. The loneliness that had nearly consumed him after Helen's death had been replaced by connection, purpose, and something he'd never expected to feel again. Hope. A small voice called out, pulling Jonas from his thoughts. "Uncle Joe!" Uncle Joe. He turned to see David running toward him, no longer a toddler but a sturdy 5-year-old boy with bright eyes and an infectious laugh. The child who'd cried at that auction so long ago now ran free and joyful, completely unaware of the darkness he'd been born into. "What is it, young man?" Jonas asked, crouching down to the child's level. "Mama says it's almost time for the ceremony." "You're supposed to come now!" The ceremony. Jonas had almost forgotten in his moment of reflection. Today was a special day, marking the 5-year anniversary of the community's founding. They'd planned speeches, a shared meal, and the dedication of a monument they'd built together. David grabbed Jonas's hand and pulled him toward the community center, chattering the whole way about the cake Grace had made and the new song they'd learned in school. Jonas let himself be led, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. The community center was packed with people, and the noise of conversation filled the air. Jonas saw familiar faces everywhere. Isaiah, now even more weathered but still sharp-minded, serving as the community's unofficial mayor and wisest counselor. Grace, who'd trained 2 new teachers and now oversaw a school system that was becoming known across Texas for its quality. Samuel and Betty, whose farm produced some of the best cotton in the region. Willie and Frank, still working on the ranch, now more family than employees. And Ruth. She stood near the front, organizing people as she always did, making sure everything ran smoothly. She'd changed too over the years. The fear that had marked her face at that auction was gone, replaced by confidence and strength. She'd become a leader in her own right, someone people turned to for guidance and support. When she saw Jonas enter with David, her face lit up with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat. Over the past year, their friendship had deepened into something more. Though they'd both been cautious, neither wanting to rush or force what was growing naturally between them. Isaiah called for attention, and the crowd settled into expectant silence. 5 years ago, the old man began, his voice still strong despite his age. 50 desperate people stood outside Jonas McKenna's ranch, hoping for a chance. We had nothing but hope and determination. We were tired, scared, and uncertain. But one man said yes. One man took a risk that changed all our lives. Jonas felt his face flush with embarrassment. He'd never been comfortable being the center of attention. But this community, Isaiah continued, was never built by one man. It was built by all of us working together. Every person here contributed. Every hand mattered. We started with nothing and built something that will outlast all of us. Isaiah paused, letting his gaze sweep across the gathered community. Today we're not just celebrating 5 years. We're celebrating what those 5 years represent. Freedom. Not just legal freedom, but real freedom. The freedom to own land, to educate our children, to build wealth and pass it to the next generation. The freedom to stand up to injustice and know we stand together. The crowd murmured in agreement. Jonas saw people nodding, some wiping tears from their eyes. We face challenges still, Isaiah acknowledged. The law may say we're equal, but many hearts haven't accepted it. We deal with discrimination, economic pressure, and sometimes outright hostility. But we've proven that we can overcome. We've shown that freed people, when given a fair chance, can build something remarkable. Grace stood next to Isaiah and spoke next. 5 years ago, I taught children their letters under a tree, using sticks to write in the dirt. Now we have a school, real books, trained teachers. We've sent 2 young people to college, and they'll return to teach the next generation. Education is freedom, and we're giving our children a gift that can never be taken away. Then came the part Jonas had been dreading. Ruth stepped forward and gestured for him to join her. Reluctantly, Jonas made his way to the front. "Mr. McKenna," Ruth said, her voice clear and steady. "You've spent 5 years trying to avoid recognition for what you started. But today we're not letting you hide in the back. This community exists because you made a choice. You walked away from an auction rather than participate in evil. Then you made an even harder choice. You opened your land and your life to strangers." She paused, and Jonas saw tears gathering in her eyes. "You gave me and my son a home when we had nowhere else to go. You gave us all a chance to be fully human, fully free. So today, on behalf of everyone here, I want to say thank you." The crowd erupted in applause. Jonas stood there, overwhelmed, not knowing what to say. He'd never thought of himself as doing anything special. He'd just made the only choices that seemed right at the time. When the applause finally died down, Jonas cleared his throat. "I'm not good with words," he began. "Never have been. But I want you all to know something. You thank me, but the truth is you saved me. 5 years ago, I was a broken man living alone, half dead inside from grief and loneliness. You gave me a reason to live again. You gave me a family. You taught me that healing comes from helping others, that the cure for loss is love." He looked at the faces surrounding him, these people who'd become so dear to him. "This community, it's not mine. It never was. It's ours. Every one of us built it together. And whatever happens in the future, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them the same way. Together." After the speeches, they unveiled the monument they'd built. It was a simple stone marker with words carved into it. McKenna Cooperative, founded 1866, built on freedom, sustained by hope, dedicated to the promise that all people are created equal. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. There was food, more than enough to feed everyone twice over. There was music and dancing, children playing games, and elders sharing stories of where they'd come from and how far they'd traveled. As the sun began to set, Jonas found himself walking toward the hill where Helen and Thomas were buried. It was something he did less often now, but today it felt right. Ruth, seeing where he was headed, fell into step beside him without asking. They climbed the hill in comfortable silence and stood before the simple wooden cross that marked the graves. Jonas had brought fresh flowers from Ruth's garden, which he laid gently on the earth. "I hope you'd be proud, Helen," Jonas said softly. "I hope you'd approve of what I've done here. I know you would have welcomed these people with open arms. You always had a bigger heart than I did." Ruth stood quietly beside him, her presence a comfort. After a moment, she spoke. "I never knew your wife, but from everything you've told me, I think she'd be very proud. Not just of the community, but of you, of how you've healed, how you've opened your heart again." Jonas looked at her, this strong, remarkable woman who'd survived horrors he could barely imagine, and still found the strength to build a new life. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You know that, right? You and Isaiah and all the others. You're the ones who made this work." "We did it together," Ruth said simply. "That's the whole point, isn't it? None of us could have done it alone." From the hill, they could see the entire community spread out below them. Lights were beginning to appear in windows as families settled in for the evening. The sounds of music and laughter drifted up on the breeze. "What happens next?" Ruth asked. "What's the next 5 years look like?" Jonas thought about it. More growth, I imagine. More challenges. The legal battles over land ownership aren't finished.